Buonasera a tutti, io vi inviterei a prendere posto così cominciamo. Io vi do il benvenuto ai consueti lunedì dell'architettura che riprendono oggi, vi do appunto il benvenuto iniziando con l'annuncio di quelli che sono i prossimi eventi che avremo qui all'INARC. Il prossimo in particolare è in programma, attenzione, non di lunedì ma di mercoledì, parlo dell'11 febbraio, è una conferenza di Pekka Helin, che è il titolare dello studio Helin & Co. Architects di Helsinki, ed è una conferenza che è stata organizzata congiuntamente oltre che da noi ovviamente dall'INARC nazionale, dalla Casa dell'Architettura e dell'Ambasciata di Finlandia qui a Roma. A questa conferenza dell'11 febbraio farà seguito il giorno seguente, se leggo bene, l'inaugurazione di una mostra dedicata appunto all'architettura recente in Finlandia. E insieme alla mostra dedicata all'architettura finlandese recente c'è anche una mostra di design prodotta dal Design Forum Finland di Helsinki, che sarà ospite sempre qui a Roma, sempre alla Casa dell'Architettura, giovedì 12. Invece il 16 febbraio, in occasione del conferimento del premio alla carriera Roma Architettura, che come sapete è andato quest'anno a Lucio Passarelli, che è un importante storico membro dell'INARC, noi abbiamo chiesto appunto all'ingegner Passarelli di in qualche modo segnare il conferimento del premio alla carriera Roma Architettura a lui e al suo studio in generale, di segnarlo con un incontro qui all'INARC, e quindi il 16, sempre alle 8 in questa sala, incontreremo appunto Lucio Passarelli, che ci farà vedere il lavoro dello studio Passarelli, che è uno studio che attraversa trasversalmente molte generazioni architettoniche qui a Roma, e che in particolare sarà salutato da Eugenio Batelli e da Amedeo Schiattarella, cioè rispettivamente dal presidente dell'ACER e dal presidente dell'Ordine degli Architetti di Roma e Provincia, e l'introduzione sarà affidata, oltre che a me, a Massimo Locci. E vediamo la serata di stasera, che invece si annuncia ancora più eccezionale, nel senso che abbiamo co-prodotto, co-organizzato noi di INARC Lazio con l'aiuto dell'INARC nazionale e con la collaborazione dell'American Academy in Rome e con il contributo di Ceramiche Appia Nuova, abbiamo organizzato una conferenza di Preston Scott Cohen. Preston Scott Cohen, come forse tutti sapete, oltre che essere un architetto molto noto internazionalmente, è in particolare in questo momento a capo del Dipartimento di Architettura della Harvard School of Design, che credo sia da tutti considerata come una delle migliori scuole di architettura che c'è al mondo. E la presentazione di Preston Scott Cohen è affidata a due architetti che vedete qui seduti al mio fianco. Il primo prenderà la parola subito in rappresentanza proprio dell'American Academy in Rome, ed è David Erdman. David Erdman è il capo di David Clovers, il suo studio. Insegna a UCLA nel Dipartimento di Architettura e di Urban Design, ed è in particolare il vincitore del premio Roma per l'architettura in questo anno 2008-2009 alla American Academy. Quindi sarà David a introdurre Preston Scott Cohen e a parlare anche a nome dell'Accademia, che ha reso possibile la realizzazione di questo evento. E poi ancora alla mia sinistra c'è Paolo Berca. Paolo Berca è un architetto che ha uno studio che si chiama West Workroom, West Office, che è basato a Milano. È autore di un libro di successo che tra l'altro ho letto perché ho avuto occasione di presentarlo, che si chiama West Workroom verso una nuova sobrietà in architettura, e ha avuto la possibilità di insegnare in questo ultimo semestre negli Stati Uniti, in particolare proprio presso la Harvard School of Design a Cambridge. E d'altra parte Paolo ha una formazione radicata negli Stati Uniti e quindi ha sempre vissuto facendo un po' la spola tra i due paesi. Io quindi inviterei subito David Erdman a dire due parole, credo in inglese, appunto a nome dell'American Academy. Subito dopo Paolo Berca introdurrà Preston Scott Cohen e poi inviteremo il nostro ospite a sedersi qui al tavolo con noi. Prego, David.
On behalf of the American Academy in Rome and Director Carmela Franklin, who regrets she can't join us this evening, I'd like to welcome Preston Scott Cohen. We're delighted to be a co-sponsor of the lecture and want to thank Livio and Paolo for organizing it. For the past 115 years, the American Academy in Rome has served as a platform for a collection of architects to come to Rome in order to study the syntax and semiology of architectural form. Few architects among the current generation of computationally driven designers have been able to reconcile aspects of the past with a more contemporary agenda. Scott's work on the sacristy of San Carlo ai Catanari here in Rome is not only valued, deep, and insightful, but unique in its ability to bind geometry with sensibility. It is, in his words, conflicted. He's one of the few architects I have known whose obsessive commitment to research and teaching has found a clear voice in his built work. The palindromic, quote-unquote, contested, geometrical drawings and analyses of the sacristy stand out as one, if not the only, example of work which is able to use the past in new, unanticipated, and I would offer interestingly uncomfortable ways. Abstract, dense, layered, and scrutinizing, these drawings are not something that one would necessarily connect with highly disciplined building practices. The Taurus and Montague houses, initial forays pushing these geometries into buildings, signaled that Scott was not only quite serious about their use, but incredibly skillful at bringing these two things, which may not usually be in the same architecture, together: a radical complexity and subdued simplicity. Reviewing the Tel Aviv Museum of Art and in typical form, Sylvia Lavin succinctly noted Scott's quote-unquote bipolar architectural sensibility, already evident in his critically acclaimed, and I would argue incredibly unique, I-beam competition entry. Coincidentally, this was developed in collaboration with Guy Nordenson, who's currently a resident at the Academy. On a personal note, it's extraordinary to see Scott building. The Tel Aviv Museum of Art confirms his ability to explore and deliver earlier obsessions in built form, what I consider to be a rare and significant talent. I look forward to seeing this and other new works he is fiendishly extrapolating from the studio. It is with my great pleasure that we at the Academy can help host his visit this week and be a part of his lecture this evening. Thank you.
Paolo. Yeah. Thank you for coming, and I should also mention that the Harvard Club of Italy played a little role in organizing this event. Circa 6 mesi fa ho passato un pomeriggio con Peter Eisenman e abbiamo parlato di tante cose, e una delle cose di cui abbiamo parlato era l'imminente elezione presidenziale americana. C'erano altre persone e ci si chiedeva se Obama avesse avuto una chance oppure no. Eisenman, come al solito, è stato molto categorico e ha detto: no way, you should never trust all those self-proclaimed liberals, because the second they enter the booth they will never put a black man into the White House. E siccome siamo a meno di 24 ore storica inaugurazione di Obama come presidente, ecco una piccola dimostrazione di come anche Eisenman, nonostante il suo ego e la sua grande sicurezza, possa risultare out of touch with the way the culture evolves. Quello stesso giorno curiosamente coincide anche col primo giorno di Scott Cohen come chairman del Dipartimento di Architettura della Harvard Design School, e ovviamente si è parlato anche di questo. E anche in questo caso Eisenman è stato molto assertive, molto assertivo, e ha detto, sponsorizzando la decisione della scuola, dicendo that this was a very good thing for the school because Scott would make architecture the center of the discussion again. E avendo passato quest'ultimo semestre, come ha detto Livio, nella scuola insegnando, posso testimoniare che questo è effettivamente il caso, e molte cose si stanno cambiando dopo un periodo di varie turbolenze di diversa natura. Eisenman ha terminato la sua sentenza dicendo, you know, Scott is a very good architect, a very good architect. Ho pensato di cercare di dire che cosa sia questo architect, e quindi dirò brevemente quello che è la mia piccola interpretazione. La referenza a Eisenman è appropriate, credo, nel senso che Scott ha studiato con Eisenman e Eisenman è stato uno dei suoi primi datori di lavoro, e in qualche modo gli eroi italiani di Eisenman, e cioè Terragni da una parte e Moretti dall'altra, sono anche importanti, hanno una certa relazione col lavoro di Scott, direi molto di più il secondo del primo, e di fatto se dovessi dire in una formula qual è la differenza tra il lavoro di Eisenman e il lavoro di Scott Cohen, è esattamente questa, che mentre Eisenman sembra non essere in grado di allontanarsi dal carattere didascalico del lavoro di Terragni, Scott Cohen sembra aver sposato in modo convincente i vari livelli di stratificazione, di complessità che si riscontrano nel lavoro di Moretti. Il suo lavoro combina infatti da un lato le più avanzate tecnologie di modellazione digitale insieme a una fascinazione per la geometria descrittiva del XVII secolo, e questa è una cosa abbastanza unica nel panorama contemporaneo. Il lavoro mette in mostra, quando visto tutto insieme, una vasta gamma di sequenze spaziali generate da elementi architettonici per lo più dislocati, che se visti, diciamo, in un'ottica complessiva, stabiliscono una personalissima interpretazione del potere della geometria come veicolo di investigazione architettonica. Scott molto spesso usa delle forme che sembrano familiari ma poi le distorce usando proiezioni oblique, con lo scopo di creare oggetti complessi che sfidano qualsiasi nozione precostituita della natura stessa dell'ordine in architettura, non dell'ordine architettonico, ma dell'ordine in architettura, ordine verso il caos. E questo penso che sia quello a cui Eisenman faceva riferimento parlando di architect, cioè di un architetto che pensa che non ci sia nulla di sbagliato nell'usare il linguaggio proprio e le forme proprie della disciplina. Ho imparato ieri, girando per il foro con Scott, che questo straordinario interesse per la stratificazione è il risultato di una prolungata esposizione avvenuta durante i suoi giorni da studente ai diversi livelli degli strati architettonici che si trovano in questa città, Roma. And I hope that for this you will help me in welcoming Preston Scott Cohen.
Thank you so much for having me here in Rome. It's a great night for me, so rare an occasion. And because, of course, I can't fail to mention it is a great night because it is the last night that Bush will be president. So I hope you remember me on this night. Associate me with this great night. Anyway, I'll be missing the inauguration in order to have been here tonight because I'll be flying during it. Anyway, it's well worth it. I made a peculiar title for the lecture tonight, which I'm going to bypass because I couldn't quite confront it. It had something to do with monumentality, but actually that will be merely a footnote to a broader theme that I believe is coursing through the projects. And for not being able to find a better word for it, I will use the word attenuation, mainly as a convenient reference because I think it describes so much about what I like to do. This, of course, being one of the great examples of attenuation here. Maybe the lights could be a little lower in the space, but I don't know. Not possible?
It can be off.
Oh, which is better, off or on? I don't know. What do you like? Do you like them on or off? Off? Everyone could sleep that way. It's much better. Anyway, basically, when we talk about this idea, I think we're dealing with extremes. And for me, this is always having something to do with geometry, always having something to do with taking something away from its normative form. But there are other ways in which I would like to talk about the problem of attenuation, not only to deal with it as something having to do with proportion, as distortion that inheres in form, but also having to do with questions of duration, a certain kind of temporality, the way in which we experience things in the long and the short, the question of attention and distraction, the way we confront form in many situations. So I will start by looking at a few different ways of looking at this and try to put the projects into these points of view. I will look at, let's say, 3 ideas about attenuation, one having to do with this, the painterly anamorphosis, that convention by which we understand perspective in a very different way. And then I will look at the plan as the locus of a certain kind of temporal continuity and discontinuity. And finally, tectonics, the way in which the material conditions and problems of construction introduce, of course, tension and compression, which relate directly to this. So, already a problem. Okay. Okay. So basically, here we are with the great problem of the anamorphic. But the anamorphic, I think, relates also to a problem you know very well, having to do with the Baroque, with a problem of distortion that's inherent not only in the form, but in the way we are asked to move about form. And if we look at this particular example, we're looking at a situation in which all of the relations that had once defined the architectural palette are in a way subordinated to the larger problem of motion, a certain kind of motion overwhelming every detail that precedes. In a certain way, it has something to do with the coarsening of architecture, this unification under curvature. Interesting situation when you consider it in later guises in the 20th century, in this very rare, this very exceptional piece, for example, by Miguel Fisac from the middle of the century in Spain, where the whole building is a series of spaces as if in motion, not only the facade. And so we see here already something related to another long tradition in modern architecture, which had to do with the way in which the whole building is caught up in the definition of motion, a certain kind of motion which is set out for a subject who moves through space in a very particular way. Very different, of course, in these 2 instances. And these are the 2 that, of course, define so much of our thinking, I believe so many architects' thinking, and very explicitly have informed the way I've been thinking. The promenade on the one hand, and of course the kind of non-hierarchical, very complex interiority of Los. And it was this, and the problem of taking it to another point, taking it to the next point, let's say, that I think has made so many strange projects of great interest to me, and in my own work led to a kind of obsession about the problem of the threshold. If you could reduce the question of the movement through architecture and the way it, let's say, redefines the form of a building, ultimately it seemed to me, or in some way through kind of an indirect investigation, that it ended up defining the whole of a building as a threshold, strangely enough. And in this case, for example, the passage through this building makes the whole of the interior something like the interval in a threshold, as if this void is something like the embrasure, the passage of a door or a window through the thickness of the wall, now scooped out, made the plan horizontally rotated, all of those transformations, a distant recollection of the problem of the threshold, but now turned horizontal. And there were projects that came from this idea where this notion of the void passage makes the whole of the building something like a portal and alters the understanding of what is inside and outside, and all of those things that will occur when everything is subordinated to a single idea. There's this kind of radical change in an understanding that we saw also in the Baroque in a very different way. And so this very large building, which is really a house and a gallery in New York State, has this kind of promenade passing through it, and then everything on the inside is a kind of interstitial territory, which is something like the back of house, the structure that supports the surface that's always on the outside. A very smooth kind of surface, so refined in its scale as to represent a very different material condition. The freedom of the windows to move, their disconnection from the structural order, and the fineness of the wood siding, implying a kind of even potential to understand it as a cast-in-place boardcrete condition, whereby the material wood is imitating concrete. And then I would say that this whole question of the passage through, which has a kind of perspectival implication, is also linked to this obsession about perspective. In this case, we're looking at Desargues' theorem, and David mentioned my concerns for these things. I should say that there are two things that come when we look at anamorphosis in architecture that interest me. One would be the case where the site precludes the development of a form that's mandated through convention, in this case the centralized church plan, not being able to be fully manifest due to a limiting site condition, requiring the invention of a kind of representation, a remarkable representation of space in the context of three-dimensional space. And then there are episodes when conditions of the site combined with other sorts of organizations have similarly led to new developments in the language of architecture. And as David mentioned, this was a long inquiry on this strange sacristy here in Rome, which I could not fail to present tonight, though I have not looked back at it, I should tell you, for quite a while. It is an exciting and extraordinary condition because of the way that there would appear to be some kind of virtuosic geometric operation undertaken in response to a very conflicted and interesting site limit. Here, this embrasure rotated at the corner that otherwise would have been pierced had the interior developed in the way that it would seem it should have on its own accord, but is, as we can see, thwarted by the pilaster. The attribution of this work is still not clear. How it is it came about on the street of Catenari, where there was a tradition of ivory carving, a kind of discreet and very interesting virtuosic craft. And here, this very concealed and almost inconspicuous piece turns out to have other functions that are of great interest. this led to my kind of research into a question about functionality, which I think pervades my work and my thinking. It has something to do with the way in which certain demands, functional demands, will, strangely enough, under certain conditions, motivate form to alter the general canon. In this case, bringing indirect light in a very stealthy way through by means of this strange embrasure, which at the same time, of course, is changing the canon by introducing a new geometrical system into it. There had not been in Baroque architecture descriptive geometry, and it's not clear that it could be argued that there ever was, even in this instance, but nonetheless, speculation is exciting. It generated ellipses, the intersection of cylinders, and that is not normally what we would find in the Baroque, where normally the oval is a two-dimensionally developed shape. And there were many projects then that followed from this obsession with cones and cylinders and other primitives and hybrids that produce the effects of other geometries, topological geometries, in such projects as that house called the Wu House, and this museum proposal for the I-beam. But I think in the end what interested me more was this question of the threshold, and it was for this project near the devastated Ground Zero for a passage that is now under construction here, that we returned to the question of the deployment of the projective system to introduce a condition within a very limited site condition situation. I actually have a film about that, a short, small film. What happens here is that there is a site between buildings which would ask for there to be a kind of provisional enclosure, a roof, and imagining just a normal canopy that would be contained in this very limited space, but distorted by the forces acting on it if we were to assume that this element is responding to a certain kind of constraint, that is of compression, manifesting a sense of compression, as if it is a diagram, let's say something like a moment diagram of the site. This single torquing, this hyperboloid, is subject to a triangulation and a folding that directly responds to the very narrow space of this setting. This alley, this minimal space, is basically in a setting where a very undesirable and dark space would normally have been, but with the kind of luminous character of the glass and the lighting, artificial and natural combined, and the counterintuitive stretching of the space, the attenuation, yes, to use the word, as opposed to the kind of orderly, successive framing of individual bays, which is typical of this type, this kind of smoothing, this singular form passing through, becomes a means to also extend the interior space of the Goldman Sachs Tower, floor plate, one of the largest trading floor plates, and making this become both part of a certain kind of very conventional condition which we're familiar with, that is of these types of coverings, but by virtue of the folding justifying an otherwise, as I said, not very attractive condition. It's as if the mass of this very, very poor hotel on the left side pressing in on it had restricted its development. And that kind of thwarting of its normal development manifests this kind of tectonic, this kind of tension, this condition of compression and attenuation along its length. You can see here how it's caught between the two buildings. But now to go to the question of the plan that I referred to, which I think is really the main and most interesting area of investigation. I thought recently a lot about it, and I tried to break down my thoughts in some way clearly at one point about the plan, and it seemed to me that it made sense to move away from the analogy with the anamorphic and to enter into some other ways of understanding. In this case, I used a very almost cliche analogy by now, which is an analogy with film. It seemed useful. Because at first what I was understanding was that we look at the promenade and we look at the compactness of Los, and we see there the question of how the plan is behaving as a cut. And the plan as a cut is either a kind of indicator of a potential rising up of form or a kind of result of a form that is made beforehand. And today we are quite familiar with the many projects that involve continuity, a kind of organic tendency, which, when cut, is producing an incidental plan of no particular significance. It is one of any number of possible plans. I would say, for example, that the Guggenheim Museum is one of the best examples of this idea, where any slicing horizontal cut is just one of a series of successive possible cuts. In this sense, the continuity of the building is concealing any particular relevance of any plan, and it is something like, as you can already anticipate, the filmic in the sense that the successive shots are concealing, by virtue of their proximity and their duration, there's a kind of continuity that is concealing any discontinuousness. And so when a building is as radical as this one, or as FOA's Yokohama, and these are very rare exceptions, though they are the obsession in the academy, they are really the most conventional, of course, with respect to this analogy with film. They involve a continuous narrative, in which we take for granted the continuity, and we do not understand any of these kinds of critical operations like montage, which allowed for the insertion of incongruent content, which allowed for very different sorts of narrative structure. Now, I would oppose that to this model of film, which I think is closer to architecture, or is really very, very close, which is Sleep, the film by Warhol, in which, of course, you probably know, for many hours we're witnessing his boyfriend sleeping, and nothing, as it were, is happening at all. And this, I would say, is more like architecture, not because of, let's say, the fact that nothing happens, which is also true in architecture, but that because the building, I would say, that is most like it would be one that is extruded. The plan that doesn't change from level to level. It's nothing like the Guggenheim, where every single cut will be different than any other one, because the building is tapering and spiraling at the same time. Here the plan is one and the same at every single instance, although there are changes indiscernible from the architectural eye in a certain way. Maybe they have something to do with engineering. There are differences, but the differences are as minor and or as insignificant as the blinking or shaking of the face that one might see in Sleep. So this kind of condition, which involves a certain kind of close scrutiny if one were to pay any close attention, this would be somehow connected to this tradition of the extruded plan, these kinds of buildings. Of course, only in a situation of a certain kind of reception, as in the case of the film, like Sleep, does this become a radical and critical act to understand architecture this way. The inactivity really is not so much a formally significant point to be speaking to. Now, there was another model of this at the same year, by the way, Marker's film, La Jetée, which I think is the one that I'm really most interested in. Here we have this narrative. We have this narrative which is made of pieces that are disconnected. These are in a kind of time capture fragments that are drawn together still shots in succession. There's a duration, though, which is breaking the continuity, obviously, that we experience in narrative film of the kind that I called anatomical. This is cutting in such a way that clearly we're dealing with discrete parts, and any kind of rendition of continuity is in great tension with that. In a way, it's photography and not film, one could say, combined with the filmic medium. This has something to do, of course, with montage. And I would say the building which is an analogy to it most clearly would be this one of 1989, the Karlsruhe Cultural Center of Rimkoolhaas, OMA, in which stacking of so many plans is accomplished with different structural systems. By virtue of piling up so many trusses, verandels of enormous dimension, plans such as this one, which are partly made of small chambers relative to the whole and larger rooms, with a kind of division running down the center, plans which produce a kind of peripheral organization around a centralized space, plans such as this one, again the centralized, the bifurcated plan, this is again a centralized figure, peristyle hall-like plan, which is made by making space within the verandel structure. So opening the plan, closing it again, this kind of constant movement between those, and notice always that the perimeter is a fixed condition. The limit is the continuity that we have in the marker film, that we have in any film. This continuity, the extrusion of the perimeter, is what sustains all of that discontinuity and makes so remarkable that the plan is changing so much. It is the opposite, of course, in that sense, of the anatomical plan, where the figure of the building is changing so vigorously and charging so much spatial energy into the building. Now, I found other examples which interested me that aren't from the high of modern architecture. This is an odd 19th century building in which we have something akin to the Los round plan, which is combined with this strange differentiation from one plan to another. Watch as this plan changes from being a centralized entry to one which bifurcates into two staircases at the perimeter. So when you come up that centralized stair, you then move up these stairs on the perimeter. And then as you proceed through the building, due to the distribution of these large rooms which are turning and taking different axial organizations, the stair migrates toward the front. I should say to the back. No, toward the front. And so the stair is this very organic and complex entity threading through these rooms that are in a way bouncing from front to back of different dimensions and heights. It's a very complex section and plan. It has those characteristics, as I've mentioned, of Los, but it's far more constrained by a perimeter condition. I think in Los we often will find that the perimeter is more forgiving than in this case. So this has something much more in common with that kind of extrusion we see because it's in between party walls. So that we see in Koolhaas. So it's more related to that continuity that I said sustains the discontinuous in the montage leggete. What interests me about these plans that are so deeply integrated and disintegrated is the effects of certain kinds of changes of mood, the effects of different kinds of contact between, let's say different programs, different densities of activity, different perceptions of depth and distance and light. Everything is drawn into the complexity of things like that. Now, I want to show a few projects that work on these models. This is a student center for a university in China, in Nanjing, that I'm doing now. Now, I would say this is a kind of, this is the closest to the anatomical of any project I have, really, because it's a very strong figure, a totalizing figure, where any plan will be quite different than any preceding. In fact, very intensely so. Let me show you to the extent to which the plans will change because of the logic of this figure. This began, let's say, as something like a spline, a line that moves around this way and ends up going under itself. But it also bifurcates at this point and goes up and winds around the tower that is, as it were, compressing and flattening this terrace. It's as if the tower is sitting on the surface that is made by this spline and also being coiled by that same surface. Now, what happens because this form moves in that way is that it works quite difficultly with the problem of so many different types of program, of different dimensions and character. We have programs for very intimate student activity. We have large auditoria. This is really a performing arts center. A very complex sequence through this building. A pleasure to kind of map out, a sequence that, let's say, does something like go up here and go over itself and come back down here, and it's a very coiled and strange kind of movement. But what I find interesting about the building is that the figure being as strong as it is, the inner chambers, all relating to each other, are forced into very broken and discontinuous relations, being pressured to be held within that limit. And then when we look at something like the stair, this is the most remarkable demonstration of the effects of what I call the anatomical plan, where each is changing relative to the previous. If you watch this stair, how it's shaping the tower, you will see, of course, that it distorts the corridor and moves around the common rooms and always is changing these rooms all the way up to the top. So it's not just at the levels of the lower where we see, of course, that we're gaining program in different ways depending on where we're cutting as we move back down, but all the way to the top of the tower. This is clearly the anatomical model in that sense. But though it is not a smooth form, this would be obviously something like that model. And then there are other questions that I haven't yet spoken to, which have to do with the way the figure, let's say, inscribes that demanding continuity by virtue of its own characteristics at its surface. In this case, and this is in a way an aside, unrelated to the narrative I am now laying out for you, but nevertheless an interesting one, I hope. We tried to intensify that continuity by rendering the building in a state of constant render, as it were. There's no light. The light is terrible in Nanjing, China. It's the opposite. Oh, could not be more opposite than Rome. It's never changing gray. So, and the color palette of the campus is gray, white, and red. And I couldn't bear white or red because they both have very bad outcomes there. So I chose gray, and I made every tone different. This, following the pattern, the winding of the form, it reinforces that spline, that continuous surface, and will be in a, as I said, constant state of render. It's as if the building will just be fixed according to one setting. This is a glazed tile, by the way, so it has a very interesting effect, the reflectivity, I believe. And we have just got to the point where we can start to see what this building will look like. This is that courtyard around which most of the programs are organized on this side of the building, which is now something like that. And these little people are toiling away, but let me tell you, this is a very exciting moment, because I don't think the building will ever be, and it's so often true with buildings like this, as exciting as they are when they're in this state of construction. We can see that this figure was always going to be seen as very distinctive in the context of very rationalized academic and dormitory structures. The camp, they did ask that there be one building that would distinguish itself. This is a campus for 35,000 students, and it was asked that we give some presence to this exceptional center of life at the campus. And this is something like, let's say, the tower, which is both for something we could say a beacon in the campus, and then this continuous umbrella under which all of the activities could congregate. I called it the buoy because the tower is sort of set adrift. So we're seeing now that the scale of the building is something quite different than what the model suggested. There's something very interesting about the way these strongly figured buildings always appear to be very miniature in the hands of the architect in the studio. It's very difficult to comprehend the scale. But I think one of the most exciting things about this building is the fact that this surface, continuing around the tower, makes it almost impossible to believe that this is not now underground, and we are very, above ground in this condition. There's something kind of remarkable about being in a building which is very evidently above the ground all of the time, but in which one feels oneself to be subterranean at certain points. This is the pattern of the tile, which was an exciting project of its own, standardized kind of herringbone. There could be nothing non-standard about it. This would be impossible in China. And here you could see very roughly, a very poor, I think, description, but still somehow give you a sense of what it will mean that this is a glazed brick. I wanted it not only to seem in a permanent state of render, but to be in a permanent state of rainy weather, too. So it's shiny. There are some other projects coming out of this kind of thinking. This is a funny project for a house in Inner Mongolia, in a place called Ordos, where there will be an exposition of contemporary experimental houses, all of which are about 1,000 square meters. That means about 700 square meters too large for me to become interested in it as a house. So I had to somehow turn it into something smaller. I put the whole house in this tower, which is something like a little townhouse, and then made a kind of leisurely villa below it, which is for all the guests and recreational activity. This double courtyard in which both seem to be adrift. Again, trying in this case, by having pushed everything underground in order that the building be as small as possible above, the task here was the inverse, to try to get these spaces to seem as if they were not subterranean. Actually, it's curious that that became the task. The plans, again, are in this kind of, I would say, mode of the anatomical section, because they're clearly arbitrary slices. And we can see here how these underground courtyards manage to sort of collect spaces around them in a loose way where one can't quite perceive what those orthogonal references are. Being in one or being in the other courtyard, this roof should seem to be that of a building in a very conventional way, and I didn't want let's say the unhappy experience of being below ground to dominate this area. Now I will come to, let's say, the project which I think goes to for the first time to the La Jetée model, but I think in a way which is quite different than the building of Koolhaas or this strange 19th century example, because here the perimeter of the building will be drawn into the problem, not only the interior. This project is the Tel Aviv Museum, and it began with the problem that there be rectangular galleries in a site that is not able to accept that shape of gallery because it's almost a triangular site. The other problem with this site, which is very important, is that half of the building would have to be below ground because there was too much program for it. So the galleries are these rectangles. They rotate in such a way that they align with the limits of the site. This one aligning, to that edge, and this one aligning to the orthogonal, which defined the original building. And then there's a middle angle. And then this space is drawing light into the lowest reaches of the building. I was very interested in the tension between the kind of continuous motion of the spectacle of the public in a museum and the contemplative spaces for exhibition in their very self-contained ways, allowing for a curatorial flexibility, which was very important there. And then there was something else very wonderful about the site, which is, of course, negative, but wonderful for me because I enjoy these tight and difficult sites. This was a site where you couldn't back up from the building, and you would always only see it on edge. It's a building that there is a kind of perambulatory circulation around, which will imitate the interior perambulation, in a way, around this element. And so it's this double skin. I've sometimes called it a kind of inner and outer dome, if you could imagine that tradition somehow relates to this. This is a very smooth interior space inside of this element. And this outside is a more brittle something, well, it has to deal with exterior conditions. These two then together allow the whole of the space between them, much as something like in the house that was the barn, where all of that is the interstitial condition. This is this space which has the Guggenheim-like movement around it, but it allows the galleries not to be entirely absorbed into this motion. We all know the beauty and also the disadvantages of the Guggenheim's continuous experience. The disadvantage, that is, of the anatomical, the kind of purely figurative architecture today, of course, is that it can only allow for certain kinds of spatial organizations. I'm very interested in it. It is absolutely compelling to deal with this kind of smoothness and continuity, but it is as interesting to deal with its discretization, its breaking down into parts, units both in levels at the level of space making and units of construction. It's that dialectic between the two. Now, I should mention that in the same year that this was designed, this wonderful project of Fisac was destroyed, and this is a kind of homage. My space here is the kind of interior inversion of this wonderful project by Fisac. But I should say also something else, which is that it's the anamorphic inflection, because it's an eccentric variation on it. The hyperbolic parabolas of Fisac are each of them symmetrical and repeated very rationally, and because they are very extreme and eccentric, in the case of the Tel Aviv Museum, very irrational actually, they produced many difficulties in terms of construction and structuring the space, about which you will see a little bit more as we go forward. But let's look at these plans, these Legete type plans, as I'm claiming them to be. In this case, as I said, the perimeter is drawn into it, but I think where the continuity lies, rather than in the extrusion and the case of Koolhaas, or this small building in the 19th century, that's the organic, the kind of internal figure is serving that role of establishing the smooth, the continuity between these discontinuous frames. And so you could say it's the anatomical model implanted in the Legete kind of montage. Let me just show you something very interesting about the plans that I think really makes it close to the analogy I'm trying to make. Let's look at this. This is the top plan. We will arrive here from the original building. If we come out of the original building here, this is the old building over here, we will ascend an escalator. This is in, let's say, in the tradition of the Guggenheim, where we go to the top and work our way down. So let's go ahead and do that just for a minute. Let's go here and go up this escalator, and then we will find ourselves passing this level and proceeding to this one. And what's interesting then is that we will sort of take this tour, which takes us up this way and around and into this gallery, and then down into this gallery and back. It's a looping kind of motion. Here is this space. This is the light bulb. The director calls it that. I didn't coin it that. But anyway, that space which is in the center. But what's really, I think, exciting is that when you descend this stair here, you will see something very exciting happen, and it really does feel astonishing, I think, when you're in it already, which is that what is an incident in this plan, this kind of rotated stair, this angle cutting as an exception to the normal geometry of this plan, the more or less normal geometry, which is these larger rectangular pieces. It will become the dominant geometry immediately, in this plan. So this moment of switching through that stair is a remarkable one in the sense that the entire plan has rotated. This plan is immediately above this one. And we have the very similar solution that Koolhaas does. We have verandels spanning, which are bridging over much larger spaces below. Here we're descending to lower levels where the library and the auditorium will be, the services and other things. But you can see that by the time we get to the bottom, we're in a very different kind of plan. And if you track some of these structures through, you'll see that they literally are piled up one on the other. And one plan to the next is combined very tenuously, though the arbitrary cut through the central twisting space has that characteristic that we experience in the Guggenheim, the anatomical, the continuous. Here we can see that episode, that stair. You can see the galleries above being very differently oriented than these that are just below. At the higher level, you can see that the plan has literally rotated under your feet. If these two galleries being parallel to one another, this one parallel to that, and just below, a very different axis is defining these parallels. And again, the recollection of the Guggenheim, but in this case, the spiral is the galleries, are freed of being bound up in the geometry of that orbit. I would say it's not far from thinking about something like this Sensatero in Milan, the perspective which is forced by the limits of the site. There is so much limiting site difficulties. There are so many here, and they are having so much to do with everything that happens in the building. Ultimately, I think when these geometries are deployed, it's only in the setting and only in the situation that they become bound up in the problem of the site that they really are of great interest. This is sort of the most exhilarating kind of approach to the problem, I think. You can start to see here how the structure is a series of rotated trusses. And in the most kind of extreme example, one of the interesting things that happens is the building is very compressed vertically by a height limit, by a water table, and the bottom rung of the truss needs to occupy a position in which allowing for passage over it, but then at certain instances has to rise or rise even further. These deviations are maddening. There are many difficulties associated with how to thread the mechanicals through the building since the plans are so discontinuous. The project architect, Amit Nimlik, who works with me so remarkably and single-mindedly, has been able to accomplish this coordination, working tirelessly with me in my office in Cambridge and now seeing the project through construction on site. This is not a building which you could ever deal with a large number of people. It's got to be known very intimately because every single episode of it is highly organic in terms of the coordination. Here you can see the kind of transferring, the gymnastics. This is a kind of acrobatic idea that's latent in the building. I would say it's this kind of funny expression in English that some people like to use. It's something like, look, ma, no hands approach. to structure, where you will be in this building. The floors will be remarkably thin. We don't have big plenums. You will be moving from one plan to another, and if you know anything about structure, if you have any sense even intuitively about it, you will wonder how this building is built, because it has this strange way of hiding and being very eccentric. Structure is an enabler, in this case, of very remarkable things. It is not, for me yet, in any of my projects, a kind of protagonist for thinking about space. Someone could say this is a shortcoming, but it's sort of innate in my blood. I like to think of structure behaving in remarkable ways to have things happen that are exceptional in space. That's that space we're looking at. And then another museum which I'm working on, I would say, is maybe the inverse, in a way, of this idea. I would say in this case, the Legité idea is contained in the continuity again, but in this case, like the lightfall centralized distorted element, a shape is putting great demands on the plan, but at this time on the outside again. Here we have something like what happened in the Nanjing Student Center, but this is a quatrefoil at its root, which is a continuous loop that does something like that. In any case, I'm not giving you the diagrams. There are whole sort of layers of different kinds of geometry of the quatrefoil manifests here. And there's a kind of there's an analog to the quatrefoil in the interior. The way in which one moves about on the interior, related but not identical to the exterior form. There's a promenade running through the building that's exterior to it, something like the way the promenade threads through the Carpenter Center or the Stuttgart Museum of Sterling, buildings that are obviously in my memory. This is this path that winds through and will come out over here. And then on the inside, we can see that on the inside of the building there is some kind of form which will end up rising all the way up to this cantilevering restaurant element, kind of culmination. Here we can see that the building has a certain kind of thickness. The plan of the building has been extruded in a certain kind of warped way and makes room and allows for the threading through of this exterior promenade. And so we have, again, this desire for the Guggenheim, this kind of compulsion to make a continuous sequence, which I seem not to be able to get away from for whatever reason, which is here this sequence where we move up, over here an escalator, and we come up this way. But one of the really remarkable things about it is that while we're rising here, we see that this path proceeds much further and beyond this central space. Though we cannot move to that position, there's this kind of caesura, this void, separating us from it, and we will have to loop all the way around here to get there, and this will have to deviate to gain clearance. The constraints that the form imposes, forcing displacements and rerouting of this linear sequence, it's really a linear building, which for a moment is winding around a courtyard. And in this linearity, I'm trying to negotiate between two different types of museum organization, the chronological and the kind of clustered galleries of independent exhibitions. A kind of freedom of choice to go only to one place or the other, and a building which one could see in a continuous loop. There it is slung out on a piece of foam. The back of the building. The interior has some of the characteristics we saw in the Israel Museum, in the sense that the plans stacking on different structural systems, but I think some other things happen which are curious. Just take note of one thing. Let's just look at a back of house administrative elevator core here for a minute, and you can see that a whole wing of educational program is happening there and is linked to the administrative program, which is now over there because of an elevator that can open backwards or forwards. I'm amused by these kinds of inversions. But they are indicative of the quatrefoil inversion, in fact necessitated by it. It would be no other way to stuff the program into that form. We have always in this building these clusters of 3 or 4 galleries on each side of the central space. Here's the final group of 3. And again, at the top, this culminating public space, which is the restaurant. The skin of the building is panelized in a certain way. I'll be talking about that by looking at the Tel Aviv's exterior. This finally now to address the concern with the question of tectonics and the attenuation of form that will affect that. Probably the most interesting of all for me at this particular moment, obviously, since I'm suddenly caught up in this question of building this large skin. And in this case, what we have is a building which is going to be precast concrete components, and we can see here this very elusive scale, which is the result of it. I mean, I would say what's remarkable about this building is that in a certain way, when you're confronted with these panels by virtue of their size, approximately 25 or 30 square meters each, and the way that they build up this curvature, the encounter both is very tactile and very kind of abstract at the same time. And that this has something to do with the elusive scale that I was very interested in attaining in this building, and I am interested in all of the buildings. It's a kind of tension between scale and non-scale, which is at work, I think, in each, even in the house, which I showed at the beginning, with the many windows, where stepping out of a door would be just like one other window in the house. This kind of identity, non-identity, scale, non-scale, is the source of this kind of notion of a different idea about the monumental that I was going to speak about a little bit. And it's not a monumental that is the result of the brute force of the material. In fact, it is super refined. It's actually coming out of the tradition of trying to perfect and refine and make as precise as possible. There's this kind of asymptotic point in space, in somewhere, a limit that one cannot reach. This approximation of pure geometry, which always puts into tension material conditions. In this case, the question of stereotomy and the Desargues theorem that's finally being brought to bear directly into the, it's literally stereotomy, the cutting of these planes and their thickness and the negotiation of their thicknesses is itself a very interesting project. That constraining condition having to do with the imitation of the casting of these with this kind of stone construction. But this is a long way from the original idea of the building, I should point out. Just to give you a little bit of context, originally the building aspired to the kind of anatomical continuity, but it did it, by the way, for a very interesting reason, or let's say a subtext that I had at the time. I was quite preoccupied with resisting the Jerusalem stone materiality that was imported into the Tel Aviv context too often for public buildings, or is being too often brought into Tel Aviv, the city of white, fluid, smooth architecture, the city that is one that inspired Mendelssohn. It's a great city architecturally, but this is a serious problem in the post-Safdi historicism period from the 70s on. So I made a building that could not be stone. There would never be a possibility with the budget we had that this could be a building built like Paris, American Center of Gary carved stone, or milled formwork, or anything like this. It would always have to be done some other way. So we thought we would do it with form work, but soon, and shortly after beginning the work on the project, it became evident that to cast this building in this shape, we would have to use flat parts, and that soon enough we would be enabling it to be stone again, and this discovery led inevitably to the building becoming a stone-clad building. I kind of relished the paradox because I kind of like these inversions, you getting caught by your own tail. I don't know, something about it excited me. I liked conceding, I liked negotiating with the concession and trying to make it work. We spent a year making the most remarkable pattern of stones that would be rationalized by being the same width of different heights, so they could establish the continuities, triangle to triangle, or quadrangle to quadrangle. Very complex pattern of stones, which I found beautiful geometrically. We could not use something so wonderful and flexible as the Graftons did in Milan. We could not have the laminate stone very thin on the aluminum corrugation, because it's a product not approved by the industry in Israel, so we couldn't hang stone upside down, and this began the demise of the stone. We did finally have to reduce the scale of the stone, and we made a mock-up. And working with a builder who wasn't at this point was hoping at this point it would not be stone, we made the mock-up not very impressive indeed, hoping that it would be the end of it. And sure enough, it was. Luckily, of course, it was only after securing the contract that the builder, who had been in conversation with us for more than a year, revealed that he did have an idea about how we could build it in concrete after all. Until then, it was absolutely impossible. And we sought every way we could to solve it. Well, there was just no way this building could be concrete because of the shape of it, and the upside-down parts, and the fact that we would need a load-bearing wall behind all of that stone concrete cladding. But finally, we made the building out of a cladding. I mean, there is no load-bearing wall. There is only the cladding. It is both the wall and the cladding, as it were. And we found a way to insulate it and mount it to a steel frame. This was a kind of breakthrough. It was a remarkable discovery, I must say, in the process of building this mock-up, which he did only to persuade, as we had hoped he would, the client and the city to allow us to proceed with this idea. The problem was that the budget was much higher for the stone building, actually, than it would need to be for the concrete. And the city was very unhappy that the profit would not be theirs, but that it would go to the builder. It was a very curious moment when, having saved money, having found a way to save money, this was a negative condition. The panels will be built inside the building. For example, in this, one of the largest galleries, there are tables set up. They are tables which are allowing a great degree of control because they're very, very smooth. And we're pouring two layers, one after the other, with a net between, 13-centimeter thick panels. And it's very controlled and smooth, and it feels like stone. It feels like marble. It's so luscious. It's so smooth. It's absolutely incredibly beautiful. And when you are seeing it, you're drawn to touch it. There's extreme tactility in a building that looks like it's made of cardboard from afar. Is one of those kinds of remarkable moments where the two material conditions of architecture are brought together. You can see the standard stone cladding of the existing building comparing in scale to this. And it was exciting to find that just the sheer presence and beauty of this kind of almost civil engineering scale of construction of pieces overcame the skepticism, the taboo about concrete, which by now is all over, rampant. There's a real contempt for concrete in this environment. So it's a building which could be despised, but for how smooth it will be. Here you can see the form of the building prior to being panelized, absolutely smooth, and now broken. I mean, you could make the analogy that to build a curve this way is something like introducing the discontinuity of the montage. But this is a very loose analogy. one of the most interesting processes was to find a way to negotiate the anamorphic kind of progressive development of the panels. They are stretching as they proceed in certain directions to make foreshortened and elongated experiences around the building. To negotiate that with the distance from the crane, because the weight of these panels is calibrated to that distance. So when we have a 45-meter crane, we have a 6-ton panel, and when we are very near the center of the crane, we can have only as much as, we could have a much heavier panel. So, I mean, we are changing the scale in relation both to the crane and a kind of overriding geometric idea. There are also the minimum and maximum angles and of the extreme corners. The geometry had to avoid certain kinds of conflicts, and it's almost impossible because when one is accepting certain hyperbolic parabolas, as I was as given, we could not change them at this late a date. The eccentricity of these hyperbolas didn't allow for triangles of very standard shapes. And so we were really putting to the test the limits of this material. You can see here all of the panels that are guilty of exceeding a limit. Here, just as a case study, we had so many of these, and we had to make so many choices of what would suffer and what would survive. And then there was the problem inside, the casting of the interior space. This was a very different kind of condition. You'll recall this diagram where I explained that this is the inner and the outer dome. You could make the argument that this is the cladding and that this is the inner structural surface. And this then is a kind of rough concrete, boardcrete. The interior is inside of this. It's the only interior space, the only truly conceptual interior, and it's smooth. It will be stuccoed. But the outside of it is rough, and then this, as I said, is clad in parts, and the steel frame between. I mean, speaking very generally, this is the idea of the building. How to build this eccentric form with boardcrete in any rational way has been a long study, an inquiry that has taken, again, another year to deal with. But ultimately, it's rather wonderful that we can rely on the characteristics of the hyperbolic parabola, that it is generated from straight lines, and that will always be the substrate that allows for the rationalization of the formwork, of the structure for this formwork. And now we see that it gives a great flexibility to moving these forms in and out. I mean, during the process of construction, the sequencing is much more flexible than initially we had anticipated because of that potential. And I'm actually now about to bring to a close the comments I wanted to make about the project, because I wanted to be able to accept any questions that you may have. But I just would say that only that I'm hoping very much that all of those ways of thinking about the question, as I said, about attenuation, will bring about a different form, a different experience. I'm not yet understanding until the buildings are realized the implications fully, but I appreciate you letting me share it with you in this state of progress. Really, thank you so much for having me, and I welcome your questions.
Io vi chiederei di accendere la luce, vorrei ringraziare molto Preston Scott Cohen per quello che ci ha detto, abbiamo ancora forse qualche minuto a nostra disposizione. Io volevo forse aggiungere una brevissima considerazione che forse potrebbe aiutare ad aprire un po' il dibattito. Lavoro molto interessante a mio giudizio e anche molto innovativo, ovviamente, ma al tempo stesso un lavoro, mi sembra, molto profondamente radicato in una tradizione oggi forse non tanto di moda, ma molto forte negli Stati Uniti degli anni 70. Io penso per esempio a un paio di edifici che oltre oltre ai molti che ci ha fatto vedere Preston come riferimenti per il suo lavoro, ma penso a due edifici che invece non ci ha fatto vedere. Uno mi sembra possa essere l'East Wing di I&P, e non è l'unico di I&P negli anni 70 che lavora su questo tipo di geometrie, e penso forse ancor più ai pilastri e alle coperture della Cattedrale Cattolica di San Francisco di Pierluigi Nervi, che per certi aspetti nascoste dietro un impianto simmetrico sperimentano proprio nella direzione che mi sembra oggi il punto di arrivo che sta così a cuore al lavoro di Scott Cohen. Ma non vorrei aggiungere altro, vorrei invece lasciare i non troppi minuti che abbiamo alle domande che forse qualcuno di voi avrà voglia di fare a Preston. Either in English we can have some questions, we have some time, oppure in italiano io posso anche dare una mano a eventualmente tradurre, sperando che siano delle domande chiare. Prego.
Yes. I was wondering, looking at the picture you were showing, I'm not sure sometimes when you have double curves and it was material, what kind of material are you using? Is it finished with the void, or is it not full?
The different projects have different solutions.
Yes, I understand. But
yes.
Inside, I was
Sure.
on the outside, I understood some were tiles,
Yes.
some were metal cladding or metal.
Mm-hmm. Well, the interiors in the museum are drywall. They're straightforward. They're acoustical ceilings in some of the spaces, but they are basically white. It's a smooth interior. The project for the Student Center, however, is a different one. The structure will be manifest to represent, well, itself, but it's basically in triangular and quadrangular organization, and there are infill areas which are filled with baffles, vertical baffles, which are giving a kind of texture to the space and making it much more evident what that geometry will need to be structurally. I think the kind of coarseness in that building is interesting, the Student Center, because, as I said, the interior spaces are also very broken and jarred by the envelope. I think it's something else in the museums where the idea is that this smooth, self-contained spaces somehow manage, despite all the pressures, to keep themselves free of trouble, keep themselves out of the trouble of the shape. And so there's this smoothness which prevails. It's arguable whether maybe the structural membering could have made itself felt and be more present, but the flexibility to subdivide galleries at will, only limited by the organization of the lighting and the mechanicals, is more desirable than to be in the situation of negotiating the structure, really. I mean, when you're dealing with the curators. So the smoothness has this kind of excuse, a programmatic reason. Yes?
I'm very curious to understand. You have basically very complex, integrated system of dealing with the boundary of the building, you play with it. Very rarely you show their connection to the outside.
No, it's not enough, definitely. Definitely not enough. That's for sure. I'm not going to name the buildings that I think it was not enough to make succeed, but I think we can find many. I hope this is not one of those. I think the judgment about the site and the living arrangement, the institutional condition, the programmatic, the reconsideration always, or consideration, I should just say, the judgment about how a building lives and its lineage programmatically is so fundamental. I mean, I don't know how to. I mean, obviously I've not put myself into too many of them, but the museum is the one that I've spent so much time on, and there is a kind of genealogy about how the museum as a palace, the museum as the cabinet of curiosity, the museum as the promenade, everything as a didactic, as a place of leisure and of education, all of the contexts of the museum, they're so important. So I think always the preoccupations of the architect, which are independent, have to be negotiated, but it's not just a negotiation. There is a drive to make architecture affect the development of the institution, to change it, to directly shape and affect the understanding of it. And I really have a hope for that. I mean, I really want this to be a type of museum that has some effect on how we deal with the question of the museum, and it's part of an architectural inquiry about that. So I don't think every building is so clear what that programmatic or institutional inquiry is, and it's not always easy to say what it is. It's harder. I think the house, there are clearly things. I mean, there's no question a house, but in a case like the student center, it's harder because I don't know what the lineage of the student center is as a program. It's not as attractive as the museum or the house. Okay, so now to go to, so it's not enough geometry. That's first of all. It may bring things together in certain ways. It may do something and act on these questions, and that's when it's interesting. As far as, and it has to connect, by the way, I insist on that, making a judgment about the site. If you're making the wrong judgment on the site, it doesn't matter what it's doing. It can be such an erroneous and irrelevant form, I think. Going to the question of the engineer, because of this attitude that the structure has to somehow enable these things. Well, at the same time, these buildings are in a constant state of changing, fighting. I mean, they're like, as he says, David Urban, a site of contestation. You can see the building morphing, frankly, through the engineer's, insistence. I mean, because the columnar distributions and the trusses and the maximums and minimums are under dispute, so too are the proportions, and I would say that I like that negotiation very, very much. I mean, we have to be honest, we have a really good relationship. The only problem we have with our engineer is that in any given moment, and it's the problem every architect has, they would rather be estimable solutions to the problems from their side. I mean, they're not interested in making commitments during the process, and they don't want to labor too much on things, and so we get to very particular points when we have discovered expansions that were not previously explained or anticipated or suggested at all. So, we have to suddenly deal with them. We're kind of getting used to that, though. I mean, this back and forth. They make trouble for us because they are, everything is provisional until the very end, whereas everything for us in every point in time is a possible final condition. And depending on how much we've invested in it, this can be hard to deal with. But I think we have a good time, generally. They like to speculate with us. They laugh at the crazy things they are forced to do for us. It's a pleasure. I like it. I like the idea of imagining that the engineers a major player in it. I don't know if Amit, the project architect, would be as humorous about it. I think he's, he gets more angry with them than I do. I'm sitting on the sideline with him and watching these terrible things happening. Sometimes it's bad, but.
Vedo che c'è un'ultima domanda, dico ultima perché temo che dobbiamo chiudere tra qualche minuto. Prego.
This is so predictable structures. How do you deal with timings and money budget?
Well, I have a very good record on the budget. I can tell you it's unbelievable. I mean, really. Well, part of it, of course, isn't me or anyone. It's beyond our control. I mean, how is it that a project fits perfectly its cost estimate and gets estimated for what it should be, and the contract is won, well, it's just political process in a way. It's not to do necessarily with me being good or somebody in my office being good. But, of course, later they decided that they hadn't known certain things. I think one of the most interesting questions about the project, about how to deal with budget, is that the knowledge about the building is sometimes determined to be only partial at very convenient points in the process. So, for example, the engineer knew very well all of the things that he could know about the building, but the builder remained ignorant on purpose, or knew things and didn't know, and it has to do with the geometry. Because they're not using the tools that we are, and because of the arbitrariness of the section, I can be very explicit about the legité and the anatomical here, we didn't have every single section you could ever make of the space in the center, and they, of course, have decided there was a lot of material there and a lot of conditions they couldn't have understood because they didn't know about it. So they tried to sue us for this, but this was just a delay tactic. It's just a game. After all, why would you buy liability insurance and work with attorneys if you're not going to get involved in suits? I mean, there's no reason not to. So they just do that. But we deal with the budget well. We have strategies for reserving, for the games everybody plays. And we brought them in on time, and we're ahead. I'm telling you, on scheduling, we're better. Because we put forward the solutions prior and are always being responded to by them. Amit Nimlik, the project architect, is so interested in the way buildings are put together. He is as interested and involved in that question as I am in the contortions of space, in a way I've never seen anybody. I mean, he's not interested in design at all. He just loves the making of buildings. And the negotiation is such a big part of that for him. We both relish the political process. We like it. So that's part of it. You have to relish winning and losing and having high and low days. That's part of the pleasure. Yeah.
Io vorrei ringraziare tutti voi, vorrei ringraziare in particolare Paolo Berca che ha innescato la possibilità di questa conferenza insieme ad Harvard Club of Italy, credo, David Bergman che qui rappresenta American Academy in Rome, l'Istituto Nazionale di Architettura che assieme a Ceramiche Appia Nuova ha finanziato e reso possibile l'evento. Grazie a tutti e soprattutto grazie al nostro ospite Preston Scott Cohen. Thank you very much.
Such a pleasure.
Indeed.
Thank you so much.
It's been
really lovely.